Hey, welcome. David here. I'm going to continue with my study sessions on consciousness. Just make sure this is working. I was speaking with this woman, Jennifer, who had these theories on reincarnation related to the quantum brain. And I had briefly mentioned in my series early about quantum consciousness as one of the potential theories. I didn't thoroughly analyze it. And so today, pardon me, I'm going to try to give a more thorough analysis of quantum consciousness. What is it? What is it? What are the different theories? I found some nice PowerPoints. I got some actual articles from Hameroff, one of the most famous developers of part of the steering committee for the annual conference on consciousness that brings together the best minds in the world on these issues. So I'm looking forward. I got some nice PowerPoints. I found a PowerPoint from Hameroff himself and Penrose and history and some related literature. So let's jump right in. And this, we're already getting to the more mystical aspects. So I wanted to cover, which I'd basically done, the extent of which science understands how consciousness exists. And we covered up to the most modern theories, including, I think it was Stephen Grossberg, the resonance model, where like a series of vibrations coming together. But the hard problem of consciousness is very far to be solved. There's a few ideas to be pushing forward. And this quantum mind is probably the most prominent of these different models, specifically the Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis. So let me enter it into a screen share. I'm going to start with some origins of the history of quantum mechanics and mysticism, because a lot of these modern understandings of consciousness, everyone I've showed in the research before, where generally physicists believe in God and spirituality as opposed to biologists who generally don't believe in God and aren't spiritual. So at the higher level, the question of like, what is matter? What is the material world? What is the origin of our perception are actually much more difficult to answer than one would think. So someone who is working with the assumption that the physicists have already made in a field like biology and forget the fundamental mental assumptions that had to go into the creation of physics. So now we get into coming back to these questions like what is matter, multiple dimensions, and different things like that that are going to be relevant. So I'm just going to introduce some good reading material on mysticism. Here's a book on Einstein, some research, someone who went through quite a bit of Einstein's, I guess they have cellars and cellars of information, his letters, his notes, conversations he had. And this isn't so much about his Judaism, but more about Einstein worldview, how he looked at the world. Because obviously we know Einstein was a Jew and he had dealings with Israel and views on the Jewish religion, although he said his God is closer to the God of Spinoza. And so just interesting. I encourage people to read this. This one's also a nice history. Just some a Muslim woman wrote, but a nice history going over the history of quantum mechanics, going through ancient Greece to the Muslims, to the development in Europe, and even some of the mystical thoughts, connections to mysticism that these practices have, because as we're going to see, most physicists were mystics. So here's a very interesting book, Quantum Questions. I found a free copy online, so anyone's watching, here's hundreds of pages of reading material about the subject. They're free online. So Ken Wilber edited 1984, 2001, and it's from the Om teachings, writings of these famous physicists. So we got Heisenberg, Schrodinger, Einstein, de Broglie, James, Planck, Pauli, Eddington. So Einstein's writings on mysticism and his statement about the spiritual and the unknown, and those are very famous. Maybe other people who follow the subject have seen some of this, but it's very interesting that physicists who came up with the theories that we understand the physical world through were very mystical people, and not only believed in different forms of spirituality and mysticism, openly wrote about it, even though those aren't very famous. The writings on mysticism outside of Einstein aren't generally very well known or famous. So I encourage people who are interested in the subject to even read through it. I sped read and skimmed it, but people who know more about quantum physics and want to know more about that, I encourage that. One more paper on this connection between mysticism and quantum physics. Just an article looking back at the historical, some of these controversies between like Einstein and his fellow physicist. Obviously, I have Stephen Gimbel, the great course professor who wrote the book on Einstein and the Jewish science, recording some of the controversies of in Germany where Einstein's ideas were denounced as Jewish. Those things are more well known, but for mystical aspects too, that they had different understandings of the world that weren't necessarily directly related to their theories, because they might have had great theories that changed the understanding of certain physical laws. They also had theories about how the world operated that may or may not have been directly relevant to the theories that they worked in, but they wrote about it and they corresponded with each other about it, and a lot of them knew the outlook and worldview of their fellow physicist. And so there's academic papers. This one maybe I'll try to read through a little bit of, and I have some nice PowerPoints, and I'm going to get into trying to explain the current state of research on the subject. So the paper argues, so here we have Marin, Mysticism and Quantum Mechanics, the Forgotten Controversy, from 2009. The paper argues that a European controversy over a mystical hypothesis, one assigning the mind a role to play at the material level of reality, shaped much of the debate over the interpretation of quantum equations. Traces back to the controversy to the past 2 decades, beginning in the late 1920s, birth of the quantum theory, and concluding with Erwin Schrodinger's lectures published as Mind and Matter. Becoming aware of the issues at stake can help us understand the historical, philosophical, and cultural background from which today's physics emerged. So in the last one, the collected writing of those physicists, that's probably just a small selection of the writings they may have done on the subject. So I encourage people to read through this, and it's interesting that you're looking back, that now we have a more evolution-based, materialistic way of interpreting the world, more mechanical. However, people who understand the science more, who've questioned it more, went to a deeper questioning: what is truth? What do we really know about the world? What can we tell to be true? How do you prove something? All these basic things that I covered in detail in the earlier public study sessions, but always worthy of review. And even for myself, that just that these words should be on the tip of my tongue, and the fact that they're not on the tip of my tongue means that I need to review it further. But you just sort of know that physicists were always mystics. Almost every physicist had some mystical understanding of these questions, soul and mind. Very few to none were complete nihilists or mechanists who believed everything was determined through mechanical. And really, to better understand their theories, it's good to read their own writing. And so here's some academic papers that scholar that read through all their writings and tried to draw some conclusions. Niels Bohr, he's calling agnostic towards mysticism and consciousness. Wolfgang Pauli is basically a Neoplatonist in consciousness. Einstein's very famous writings and ideas about mysticism and Planck's reaction, Max Planck. It's very interesting. I encourage people to read it. I skimmed through it. I wish I had more time to go through. So let's get into a PowerPoint about what we're going to be talking about, and then I'll try to read some of the different major scientific theories. So I'm going to try to show a few PowerPoints that just ask, like, what is quantum consciousness? What are the current theories? What is the evidence for them? So I've gathered a decent amount of PowerPoints that will show what exactly are they talking about when we talk about quantum consciousness. Do you have to understand quantum theory and quantum mechanics, stuff that really is master's degree physics work to understand this stuff that requires extreme knowledge of calculus and high-level mathematics? Can you understand quantum consciousness without you basically having a master's degree in mathematics? And you can understand parts of it, and so that's why I've collected some simple PowerPoints. Okay, here's one from a professor. Let me see if let's look at this one. This one's largely related, most of it, and we'll look at the other one next. So this is from a course, upper level, like junior level college course, Mind and Artificial Intelligence, talking about artificial intelligence, but I want to get into the slides here that were from the better ones I could find on this subject. Sorry, my roommate's coming in if there's a little background noise. So we talked a lot about the neurons and how the brain works in the previous study sessions, and trying to model the mind based on neurons and like electric signals compared to a computer. So quantum consciousness is going to be the step up, where it's not just like the mind is not just an electric computer like the one I'm using right now or any of us are using to use this, but this actual quantum computing. So here's your basic understanding of the neural activity and the computing of how our brain functions. Okay, so quantum computing comes in a lot of these. You have these microtubules, which are I get part of a neuron, part of the neural complex. So these microtubules in the neurons are going to be proposed to like tap into multiple dimensions or being pickup receivers for these greater signals that exist in the world. And these could be demonstrated to be like electromagnetic or gravity. So this is more conceptual physics that we're talking about, where so it's not just the brain working as some sort of computer through electrical signals being able to form logic circuits that eventually lead to consciousness. We're actually talking about picking up on signals from the quantum world through these microtubules, and you'll see that. So it's going to get semi-complicated, but you just want to get an overview of what actually this theory is. And as we saw, the neural network of the mind, with the mind is just computer, just neurons, could not produce a model that would arise to consciousness. There are a few directions in the theory, but as of now, none of the models of just the mind as neurons, electrical signals being able to lead to consciousness have been developed. So this is actually a much more serious attempt at solving the hard problem of consciousness than the electrical models we had earlier. So there's a question we're going to talk about later. Consciousness is if it's a product of these microtubules that exist possibly not just in the human brain, but all over in every cell and in smaller organisms, that there's going to be consciousness in other life forms. And we're going to re-examine what consciousness means, and is there consciousness in all life, not just humans, and not arising from the brain. And some of this is more, say, neurobiology, which I'm not going to cover in these in this public study session. I'll check the chat in a minute if anyone knows more about this than me. So the famous Roger Penrose, physicist, mathematician, is one of the major contributors to this theory, among a number of researchers proposing that there is a quantum computing going on in the brain and quantum effects are responsible for the flash of insight phenomenon. Penrose proposes that quantum computing is happening in the microtubules of neurons, which is responsible for consciousness. So, mathematics, we have Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Any set of mathematical axioms, it is possible to produce a statement that is obviously true, but could not be proved by means of the axioms. The theorem showed that the brain had the ability to go beyond what could be achieved by axioms or formal systems. That's Penrose argument. Mind had some additional functions that was not based on algorithms, but a computer is driven solely by algorithms. Brain could perform a function that no computer could perform, called idea of non-computable functioning. So not all human intelligence is algorithmic. Physical laws are described by algorithm, not easy to come up with physical properties or processes that are not described by them. How do we then explain the implied superiority of the human brain? Hence quantum physics and the quantum brain. So quantum theory of coherence and decoherence. It's just good to go over these concepts before we jump into the literature. For some of you who are hopefully more familiar with this, you could add your comments to the chat, and people who've never heard of these concepts, just to say over the main points, hopefully is worth it. And then I'm going to go in and try to read from some of these articles. So quantum theory, coherence and decoherence. Sufficiently isolated quanta can be viewed as waves of probability. Quanta subject to measurements, interaction with the environment, wave characteristic lost in particles found at the specific point, called collapse of the wave function. It's not a cause and effect process. No system of algorithms can describe the choice of position for the particle. Seems to suit the search, but randomness, not a promising basis for mathematical understanding. So objective reduction, Penrose proposition of a new form of wave function collapse. Relativity, mass causes curvature in space-time fabric, continuous or relativistic scale, but a network of quantum scale. Reconciliation of relativity in quantum physics. Propositions, each quantum superposition has its own curvature. Blisters on the space-time fabric. Above Planck scale, gravity comes into effect. Systems become unstable. Collapse was to choose just one of the possible values called objective reduction. So objective reduction has actual mathematical formulas. So this is a full scientific theory based that could be reduced to mathematics. So the choice of states is neither random, as are choices following measurement or decoherence, nor completely algorithmically. So here we're going to get into the Orch OR model, and we're going to see more about this. I have a few papers on this, which is one of the most working models right now of this theory. So microtubules may be supporting quantum process, shadows of the mind that the Penrose-Hameroff model will be looking at, comprised of subunits of the protein. Tubulins contained hydrophobic water-repellent pockets, hydrophobic pockets from different tubulins within 2 nanometers of one another, close enough to the pi electrons of the tubulins to become quantum entangled. So quantum entanglement is a state in which quantum particles can alter one another's properties instantaneously and at a distance in a way which would not be possible if there were large-scale objects obeying the laws of classical as opposed to quantum physics. Principle of non-locality, the ERP experiment, Hameroff's position, large number of pi electrons can become involved in Bose-Einstein condensate. So the Bose-Einstein condensate These occur when large number of quantum particles become locked in phase and exist as a single quantum object. Happens usually at a very tiny scale, but can be boosted to a large-scale influence in the brain. The gap junction, intercellular connections between cells, allows various molecules and ions to pass freely between cells in addition to the synaptic connections. Proposition condensates in microtubules, and one neuron can link with other neurons via gap junctions using quantum tunneling. Allows the Bose-Einstein condensates to cross into other neurons, extend across a large area of the brain as a single quantum object. When condensates in the brain undergo an objective reduction of their wave function, there is an instance of consciousness. Brain gets access to non-computational processes embedded in the fundamental level of space-time geometry. So Orch OR causes gamma synchronization. Microtubules both influence and are influenced by the conventional activity at the synapses between neurons, orchestrated OR. The criticism of the model, Penrose hypothesis, yet to be supported by experimental evidence. Tegmark, I actually bought Tegmark's book. Someone in the chat on the Luke Ford show recommended Our Mathematical Universe. I've read the first chapter of that, but Tegmark, microtubule quantum states would persist for only 10 to 34 seconds. At brain temperatures, Hameroff counters that argument. We'll see that later. Far too brief to be relevant to neural processing, rapid decoherence. So Hameroff tolerates Tegmark's model incorrect. 24 nanometers is too far. Shielding by water molecules, pumped into coherent state by biochemical energy, quantum error corrections. Some people see that Penrose is obviously right. Some people see that Penrose is obviously wrong. What's obvious then is that the issue is not obvious. So consciousness and quantum physics. So earliest propositions, you had John Jeans, which I'd shown earlier. The writings are in that paper, that book that I connected. So you had two major schools of thought. You have the Copenhagen interpretation and the Bohemian interpretation. The Copenhagen interpretation saying the wave function is complete and literal description of the state of quantum system. Reality exists only when you measure it. Schrodinger's cat experiment, possible explanations, consciousness collapses the wave function and thereby creates reality. Whole universe must have existed originally as potentia in some transcendental realm of quantum probabilities until self-conscious beings evolved. So the Bohemian interpretation, real existence of particles and fields implicate order, a vast ocean of energy on which the physical or explicit world is just a ripple. Already present in quantum physics, the quantum vacuum or zero-point field, perhaps something like the affidavit principle in the Indian philosophy. So mind offers a model to pursue the goal for human-like intelligence. However, the exact working of the human mind is far from trivial. Consciousness research effort should help us get closer and closer to the knowledge of the actual principles of the human mind and brain. We have already covered long distance, simple systems, quantum physics. Okay. We got anything? Okay. So, see the state of my karma in the chat. If there's any questions or just an update on the state of my present state of karma. Okay, well, so I appreciate you watching. Let me do this other. I'll show you some pictures. So this is Hameroff. We're going to get in some of these readings, and but Professor Hameroff, Dr. Hameroff, anesthesiologist, director of consciousness studies in Arizona. One of the major founders of the theory we'll be talking about today, has some slides on his webpage. I encourage people to look at. He's got a lot of material available. So with this concept, we say that understanding the overview of it, how quantum physics works, what entanglement is, and how that could apply to consciousness, and we're going to get more into that. When this concept, would this apply consciousness being a unique function of the human brain, or is it possible that consciousness is something that pervades the universe? Even if humans didn't exist, there would still be a universal consciousness. And so here in we're just going to go with it. He's an evolutionist, although a mystic. Professor Hameroff is a basic evolutionist with some sort of mystical forces added in. So here he has your concept: did consciousness arise at the Big Bang? Did consciousness arise with the first eukaryote cells, or the Cambrian explosion, or with humans, or when the Earth began? And so those are all, you're just pointing out the possibilities. So what came first, consciousness or life? So neuroscience, psychology, Western philosophy says life gave rise to consciousness. Consciousness emerged from living systems. As were panpsychism, Eastern philosophy, spirituality, Penrose-Hameroff, Orch OR, consciousness is intrinsic to the universe and preceded life. So according to this second theory that we're going to be looking at, so did life originate and evolve to optimize consciousness? So saying consciousness did not evolve. Consciousness is a reality in the world that exists even without life, but life evolved around tapping into this force consciousness, which is probably more in line with Hameroff, less in line with my views, but we won't be discussing my views this video, just giving an overview of the current state of scientific research. So there's even questions: what is life? Is life a simple replicator, like JF and the Dawkins belief? And then what about non-material replicators? So vitalism, unifying energy, field, life force, pervading living systems. So this was originally a mystical idea, but now scientists have tried to incorporate science into their mysticism, basing it on forces like electromagnetism or these quantum forces. So, the old mystical vitalism became taboo. However, science couldn't answer these questions. So you have the quantum vitalism. So Erwin Schrödinger suggested life's unitary oneness derived from quantum coherence in biomolecular lattices. Plants use quantum coherence in photosynthesis to make energy and food. Quantum coherent transfer of electron excitations, excitons among nonpolar pi resonance clouds. There's some evidence that this phenomenon occurring in natural processes. So, your melding of quantum and classical, where most of us think in terms of classical, even though we know that quantum supersedes the classical and is more truthful of what's actually happening at the real level of the material realm. So, Professor Hameroff has some nice pictures here to help understand what's going on. The multiple worlds hypothesis, and people know, like Schrodinger's equation, where the position of a particle is basically a probability. It could be in different places. You don't know where it is. It's just a probability. And so with that probability of the multiple worlds hypothesis, that really all different states exist. And so particle exists in superposition in two or more locations at the same time. And to see, like two possibilities of something actually happening at the same time, or different possibilities leading into multiple universes. And this is kind of what he was talking about with his proto-consciousness of the simple, pervasive, we might have the multiple realities theory of people having different minds. So this is going to get pretty complicated. So whatever people could get out of it, good, and hopefully we'll talk more. And this will lead to further thinking. into some overview of the basic science. Trying to skip through this because we have a lot to cover. These are on Professor Hameroff's webpage if someone wants to go to his webpage and find more information. So here we're coming to the birth of the microtubule. So we've been tracing the evolutionary, he's been tracing the evolution according to the basic theory till the rise of the microtubule, the protein tubulin. And here is his theory: consciousness arises at the microtubule, although it's possibly even a simpler consciousness that was around earlier. And so trying to give a physical representation of what he means happening at these very small protein levels of the microtubule. So here, in the chart, we have his Orch OR hypothesis in your basic evolutionary scale, where the microtubule comes into play. And that would be the beginning of some sort of higher consciousness on Earth. That this physical structure of the microtubules is able to tap into this realm of consciousness that always existed. So it's pretty complex, and that's why I'm just going over this, to somewhat learning some of the terminology in this and thinking through it. Although I did read through this before and went through these slides a few times. I'm by no means an expert in this theory, and that's why it's a public study session, encouraging other people to look into it, and we could talk about this further. I'll give you the overview and current state of research. So Penrose-Hameroff Orch OR is the most rigorous, complete, and successfully tested identity theory of consciousness yet put forth. Life evolved to optimize pleasurable qualia to feel good, e.g. derives from beats of higher frequency microtubulin vibrations inside brain neurons, clinically enhancing microtubule resonance and function by transcranial ultrasound may help Alzheimer's and other disorders. It also have effects in treating different diseases, brain injuries, Alzheimer's, PTSD, depression. Definition: panpsychism, consciousness is a universal feature of all things. So such thinkers Plato, Thales, Spinoza, Leibniz, James, Vedanta, Buddhism, Whitehead, Fechner, De Quincey, Stubbenberg, Rosenberg, a lot of people, Chalmers, are what you would call in the school of panpsychism. Criticism of panpsychism: you have Searle, the simple lack of evidence that the physical entities have any mental attributes, but no evidence supports human consciousness, Searle's included, other than one's own consciousness, cogito ergo sum. So how does consciousness of a thing, an atom, differ from that of a human? Combination problem: how the atoms are combined, nothing solved. What is a thing? Atoms are composed of subatomic particles, mostly empty and derived from quantum origins. Okay, good stuff. Check the chat. Okay. Rune, thanks for giving me the Niels Bohr quote. It's interesting. I think Niels Bohr was a half Jew. And so Niels Bohr is kind of like whatever you say it is about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And I thought that was kind of funny, like the half Jew, whatever you say he is, he is. Was Niels Bohr a goy, or was he a Jew? And so whatever you say he was. But there's a lot of interesting takes that could be derived from these characters and their thoughts. So hopefully people are enjoying this. I'm just going to be talking straight about these quantum mechanics. If people want to update me on the present state of karma in the chat, enjoy. So let's look at just a background of the different theories that are out there. So you got a few PowerPoints out there. So this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and so we're going to look at the main different theories of quantum consciousness that exist. So, I encourage people to look back on my other presentations, a lot of information about the origin of consciousness and the different theories. Just read a little bit. The original motivation of the early 20th century for relating quantum theory to consciousness was essentially philosophical. It is fairly plausible that conscious free decisions, free will, are problematic in a perfectly deterministic world. So quantum randomness might indeed open up novel possibilities for free will. Quantum theory introduced an element of randomness standing out against the previous deterministic worldview, in which randomness, if it occurred at all, simply indicated our ignorance of a more detailed description. In sharp contrast to such epistemic randomness, quantum randomness in processes such as spontaneous emissions of light, radioactive decay, or other examples of state reduction was considered a fundamental feature of nature, independent of our ignorance or knowledge. To be precise, this feature refers to individual quantum events, whereas the behavior of ensembles of such events is statistically determined. The determinism of individual quantum events is constrained by statistical laws. Other features of quantum theory which we found attractive in discussing issues of consciousness were the concepts of complementarity and entanglement. Pioneers of quantum physics such as Planck, Bohr, Schrödinger, Pauli, and others emphasized the various roles of quantum theory in recognizing the old conflict between physical determinism and consciousness free will. So contributions, some popular approaches for applying quantum theory to consciousness will be surveyed and compared, most of them speculative with varying degrees of elaboration and viability. Section 2 outlines two fundamental different philosophical options for conceiving of relations between material and mental states of systems. Section 3 addresses three different neurophysical levels of description to which particular different quantum approaches refer. After some introductory remarks, Section 4 sketches the individual approaches themselves. Okay, so I encourage people to read through this whole thing. Like an hour and a half, 2 hours. Okay, see the microtubuli, the lowest neurophysiological level at which quantum processes have been proposed as a correlate to consciousness, is the level at which the interior of single neurons is considered their cytoskeleton. It consists of protein network essentially made up of two kinds of structures, neurofilaments and microtubuli, which are essential for various transport processes within neurons. Microtubuli are long polymers, usually constructed of 13 longitudinal alpha and beta tubulin diamonds arranged in a tubular array with an outside diameter of about 25 nanometers. The tubulins in microtubular are a substrate which, in Hameroff's proposal, is used to embed Penrose theoretical framework neurophysiologically, as will be discussed in more detail in Section 4.5, turbulent states are assumed to depend on quantum events so that quantum coherence among different turbulence is possible. Furthermore, a crucial thesis in the scenario of Penrose and Hameroff is that gravitational-induced collapse of such coherent turbulent states corresponds to elementary acts of consciousness. I encourage people to read this. Let's look at Van Neumann. So Van Neumann, 55, discusses the conceptual distinction between observe and observing system. In this context, he applied the transition of quantum state to an eigenstate of the measured observable. This transition is often called the collapse or reduction of the wave function, as opposed to the continuous unitary reversible evolution of a system according to the Schrodinger's equation, to the general situation of measured object system. A measuring instrument in the brain of a human observer. His conclusion was that it makes no difference for the result of measurements on one whether the boundary between observed and observing system is positioned between 1, 2, or 3. As a consequence, it is essential whether the detector or the human brain is ultimately referred to as the observer. So by contrast to von Neumann, fairly cautious stance, London and Bohr went much further and proposed that it is indeed human consciousness which completes quantum measurements. This is pretty complicated. We're going to get back to some more of this Van Neumann and what is consciousness. Just to get some of these historical points in the development of this theory, because this theory has been building up for well over 100 years. So in the 1960s, he formalized quantum field theory to describe brain states with particular emphasis on memory. The brain idea is to conceive of memory states in terms of states of many particle systems as equivalent representations of vacuum states of quantum fields. The proposal has gone through several refinements. Major recent progress has been achieved by including effects of dissipation, chaos fractals, and quantum noise. So quantum field theory yields infinitely many representations of the canonical communication relations, which are equivalent to the Schrodinger representation of standard quantum mechanics. Such inequivalent representations can be generated by spontaneous symmetric breaking, occurring when the ground state of a system is not invariant under the full group of transformations, providing the conservation laws for the system. Okay, so just to conserve time, I'm not going to read through that much of this. Let's skip straight to Penrose and Hameroff, quantum gravity in microtubuli. In the scenario developed by Penrose and neuropsychologically augmented by Hameroff, quantum theory is claimed to be effective for consciousness. By the way this happens, it is quite sophisticated. It is argued that elementary acts of consciousness are non-algorithmic, non-computable, and they are neurophysiologically realized as gravitation-induced reductions of coherent superposition states in microtubuli. Unlike the approaches discussed so far, which are essentially based on status quo quantum theory, the physical part of the scenario proposed by Penrose refers to future developments of quantum theory for a proper understanding of the physical processes underlying quantum state reductions. The grander picture is that a full-blown theory of quantum gravity is required to ultimately understand quantum measurement. This is a far-reaching assumption, and Penrose does not offer a concrete solution to this problem. However, he gives a number of plausibility arguments which clarify his own motivations and have in fact inspired others to take his ideas seriously. Penrose's rationale for invoking state reduction is not that the corresponding randomness offers room for mental causation to become efficacious. His conceptual starting point at length, developed in 2 books, is that elementary conscious acts must be non-algorithmic. Phrased differently, the emergence of conscious act is a process which cannot be described algorithmically, hence cannot be computed. His background in this respect has a lot to do with nature of creativity, mathematical insight, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and the idea of Platonic reality beyond mind and matter. Contrast to the unitary time evolution of quantum processes, Penrose suggested a valid formulation of quantum state reduction replaces van Neumann's projection postulate must faithfully describe an objective physical process that he calls objective reduction. Since present-day quantum theory does not contain such a picture, he argues that effects not currently covered by quantum theory should play a role in state reduction. Ideal candidates for him are gravitational effects, since gravitation is the only fundamental interaction which is not integrated into quantum theory so far, rather than modified elements of the theory of gravitation. To achieve such an integration, Penrose discusses the reverse, that novel features have to be incorporated in quantum theory for this purpose. In this way, he arrives at the proposal of gravitational-induced objective state reduction. Why is such a version of state reduction non-computable? Initially, one might think of objective state reduction in terms of stochastic process, as much current proposals for such mechanisms indeed do. This would certainly be indeterministic, but probabilistic and stochastic processes can be standardly implemented on a computer, hence they are definitely computable. Penrose sketches some ideas concerning generally non-computable, not only random, features of quantum gravity in order for them to become viable candidates for explaining the non-computability of gravitational-induced state reduction. A long way still has to be gone. With respect to the neurophysical implementation of Penrose's proposal, his collaboration with Hameroff has been crucial. With his background as an anesthesiologist, Hameroff suggested to consider microtubules as an option for where reductions of quantum states can take place in an efficient way. This respective quantum states are assumed to be coherent superpositions of tubulant states, ultimately extending over many neurons. Their simultaneous gravitational-induced collapse is interpreted as an individual elementary act of consciousness. The proposed mechanism by which such superpositions are established includes a number of involved details that remain to be confirmed or disproven. The idea of focusing on microtubuli is particularly motivated by the argument that special locations are required to ensure that quantum states can live long enough to become reduced by gravitational influence rather than interactions with the warm and wet environment within the brain. Speculative remarks about how the non-computable aspects of the expected new physics mentioned above can be significant in this scenario. Okay, so encourage people to read through this so that don't have time to read it all. Mind and matter as dual aspects. Dual aspects approaches consider mental and material domains of reality as aspects or manifestations of one underlying reality in which mind and matter are unseparated. In such a framework, the distinction between mind and matter results from the application of a basic tool for achieving epistemic access to gather knowledge about both the separating domains and the underlying reality. Consequently, the status of the underlying psychophysicality neutral domain is considered as ontic relative to the mind-matter distinction. Dual aspect approaches have a long history, essentially starting with Spinoza as the most outspoken protagonist. Major directions of the 20th century have been described and compared to some detail. An important distinction between the two basic classes of dual aspect thinking is a way in which the psychophysically neutral domain is related to the mental and the physical. For Russell and the neo-Russellians, the compositional arrangements of psychophysically neutral elements decide how they differ with respect to mental or physical properties. As a consequence, the mental and the physical are reducible to the neutral domain. Chalmers' ideas of consciousness and information falls into this class. Tononi's theoretical framework of integrated information theory can be seen as a concrete implementation of a number of features of Chalmers' proposals. No quantum structures are involved in this work. The other class of dual aspect thinking is decompositional rather than compositional. Here, the basic metaphysics of psychophysically neutral domain is holistic, and the mental and physical emerge by breaking the holistic symmetry, in other words, by making distinctions. The framework is guided by the analogy of quantum holism, and the predominant versions of this picture are quantum theoretically inspired, as, for instance, proposed by Pauline Jung and Bohm and Hiley. They're based on speculations that clearly exceed the scope of contemporary quantum theory. In Bohm's and Hiley's approach, the notions of implicate and explicit order mirror the distinctions between ontic and epistemic domains. Mental and physical states emerge by explication or unfoldment from an ultimately undivided psychophysically neutral implicate. In folded order, this order is called hollow movement because it is not static but rather dynamic, as in Whitehead's process philosophy. Degas and Hiley give a good introduction of how the hollow movement can be addressed from a formal algebraic point of view. The level of the implicate order, the term active information expresses that this level is capable of informing the epistemically distinguished explicate domains of mind and matter. At this point, it should be emphasized that the usual notion of information is clearly an epistemic term. Nevertheless, there are quite a number of dual aspect approaches addressing something like information on the ontic, psychophysical, natural level. Using information like concept in a non-epistemic manner is inconsistent if the common significance of Shannon-type information is intended. So while the proposal of Bowman-Hilly essentially sketches conceptual framework without further concrete details, particularly concerning the mental domain, the suggestions of Pauline Jung offer some material to discuss. An intuitively appealing way to represent their approaches considers the distinction between the epistemic and the ontic domains of material reality due to quantum theory in parallel with the distinction between epistemic and ontic mental domains. Okay, to cover. So there's been an old idea by Bohr that central conceptual features of quantum theory, such as complementary, are also of pivotal significance outside of the domain of physics. In fact, Bohr became familiar with the idea through the psychologist Edgar Rubin and more indirectly William James, and immediately saw its potential for quantum physics. Although Bohr was also convinced of the extraphysical relevance of complementarity, he never elaborated this idea in concrete detail, and for a long time after him, no one else did so either. This situation has changed. There are now a number of research programs generalizing key notions of quantum theory in a way that make them applicable beyond physics. Of particular interest are the approaches that have been developed in order to pick up Bohr's proposal with respect to psychology and cognitive sciences. The first steps is this direction were made by the group of Ayers in the early 1990s. Using non-distributed proposal lattices to address quantum-like behavior in non-quantum systems, alternative approaches have been initiated, focusing on non-classical probabilities, outlining an algebraic framework with non-commuting operations. Other lines of thinking are due addressing complementary with partial Boolean algebras, indicating links between basic conceptual categories in quantum physics and psychology. Formal move to incorporate quantum behavior in mental states systems without referring to quantum brain activity is based on one state space description of mental systems. If mental states are defined on the basis of cells of a neural state space partition, then this partition needs to be well tailored to lead to robustly defined states. Ad hoc chosen partitions will generally create incompatible descriptions. This implies the quantum brain dynamics is not only a possible explanation of the quantum features in mental states, assuming that mental states arise from partitions of neural states in such a way that statistical neural states are coextensive with individual mental states. The nature of mental processes depends strongly on the kind of partition chosen. If the partition is not properly constructed, it is likely that mental states and observables show features that resemble quantum behavior, although the correlated brain activity may be entirely classical quantum mind without quantum brain. Intuitively, it's not difficult to understand why non-commuting operations or non-Boolean logic should be relevant, even inevitable for mental systems that have nothing to do with quantum physics. Okay, so there's a lot of mathematics, a lot in this. I really want to cover as much as possible. This is pretty complicated, but time is limited. Historical motivations for exploring quantum theory and trying to understand consciousness derive from realizations that collapse-type quantum events introduce an element of randomness, which is primarily rather than merely due to ignorance or missing information. Approaches such as Wigner, Stapp, Beck, Eccles emphasize this insofar as the ontic randomness of quantum events is regarded to provide room for mental causation. The possibility that conscious mental acts can influence brain behavior. The approach by Penrose and Hameroff also focuses on state collapse with significant move from mental causation to non-computational of particular conscious acts. Any discussion of state collapse or state reduction refers at least implicitly to superposition states, since those are the states that are reduced insofar as entanglement systems remain in quantum superposition. As long as no measurement has occurred, entanglement is always co-addressed when state reduction is discussed. By contrast, some of the dual aspect quantum approaches utilized the topic of entanglement differently and independently of state reduction in the first place. Inspired by the entanglement-induced non-local correlations of quantum physics, mind-matter entanglement is conceived as the hypothetical origin of mind-matter correlations. This reflects on a highly speculative picture of fundamental holistic, psychophysically neutral level of reality from which correlated mental and material domains emerge. Each of the examples discussed in this overview has both promising and problematic aspects. The approaches by Beck and Eckley is the most detailed and concrete with respect to the application of standard quantum mechanics in the process of exocytosis. However, it does not solve the problem of how the activity of single synapses enter the dynamics of neural assemblies, and it leaves mental causation of quantum processes as a mere claim. Stapp's approach suggests a radically expanded ontological basis for the mental domain of the status quo quantum theory as a theory of matter without essentially changing the formalism of quantum theory. Although related to inspiring philosophical and some psychological background, it still lacks empirical confirmation. The proposal by Penrose and Hameroff exceeds the domain of present-day quantum theory, and by far is the most speculative example among those discussed. It is not easy to see how the picture as a whole can be formally worked out and to put to empirical test. The approach initiated by Umezawa is embedded in the framework of quantum field theory, more broadly applicable and formally more sophisticated than standard quantum mechanics. It is used to describe the emergence of classical activity in neuronal assemblies on the basis of symmetry breakings in quantum field theoretical frameworks. A clear conceptual distinction between brain states and mental states has often been missing, but this ambiguity has recently been resolved in favor of brain states. The relation to the mental states is ultimately left open. Some of Vitello's accounts suggest a vague inclination toward dual aspect approach. The dual aspect approach is of Pauline Jung and Bohm and Hilly are conceptually more transparent and more promising. On the other hand, they are essentially unsatisfactory with regard to sound formal basis and concrete empirical scenarios. Hilly's work offers an algebraic framework which may lead to theoretical progress. A novel dual aspect quantum proposal by Primus based on the distinctive between tensed mental time and tenseless physical time marks a significant step forward, particularly as concerns of a consistent formal framework. Maybe the best prognosis for the future suggests among the examples described in this overview, at least on foreseeable timescales, goes to the investigation of mental quantum features without focusing in associated brain activity to begin with. A number of corresponding approaches have been developed, which include concrete models for concrete situations and have led to successful empirical tests and further predictions. On the other hand, a coherent theory behind individual models and relating to different types of approaches is still to be settled and detailed with respect to significant scientific practice. A particularly promising aspect is the visible formation of a scientific community with conferences, mutual collaborations, and some perspicuous attraction for young scientists to join the field. Hence, this public study session trying to encourage people to research this topic. Okay, let me check the chat. Only going to try to refer to questions related to the topic at hand. This is extremely complicated stuff. So, I mean, states regarding my karma and different things we're involved in. I just want to focus right now purely on this concept of quantum consciousness. I don't have time either to discuss the Vedic connections. I'm just going to be discussing the state of the modern science, although there is a lot of writings. I said these people corresponds to India and connections with all sorts of metaphysics, Kabbalah, and everything. Although this public study session, I want to focus purely on the science. So let's do a PowerPoint that will help visualize some of these very complicated concepts. And you want to look up, there's quite a few more PowerPoints from these authors that have, the nascent systems. If someone wants to look up more these on this issue. So these are somewhat related theories just to help conceptualize what is consciousness and So the whole universe is an activity that can be described by an action model of reality. In such a model, the description of observable experience is given by specifying the amount of action experienced by the activity in a state. The description of the physical explanation of those observable experiences provided by a model of physical reality. So you have what's really happening, and then you have our perception of what's happening based on our measurement and explanatory processes. And here you might have the two different people who have two different models of reality, where I perceive reality to be one thing, another person perceives reality to be different based on different measurements and explanatory processes. And within that, we could have interactions based on our different ways of measuring and explaining what's going on. You add some more elements to this basic theory. You have your experiences, internal and external explanations, so you get quite mathematical. You have it like in and out, from the entering of perceptions to the mental cognitions, and these you'll get quite complicated. So these are pretty complicated slides, so you see that it requires quite a bit of mathematics. We'll go into these theories, but I thought these were pretty cool, helping visualize what's going on. And in reality, would be like Kabbalistically, like loops within loops within loops within loops. The mapping consciousness scale level. We're talking the Planck scale. What we talked about, the observed and the observer. That in quantum theory, detector arrays are Hilbert space containing de Broglie waves are actualized by a hierarchy of observer-observed layers. Measurement level of different brain activity. Where you get down to the microtubules. So some of the people who know biology better, try to understand what's going on, what these microtubules are, where they fall in at the quantum scale, and how these could be like the vector to intercept these quantum particles and have these quantum computers. I mean that the quantum computing has been happening, literally under our nose the whole time. So we were talking about the orchestrated reduction in the quantum approximation. To make a measurement of the Poynter particle must move. Bayer's theory shows charge mass displacement, cycle implement measurement. So it's pretty complicated because you have the Schrodinger's equation concept that you can't, when you measure something, you ruin it, so to say, and you can't know something's position and velocity at the same time. And okay, so trying to correspond all these different things. Yeah, I mean the Jews have a Kabbalistic understanding of karma, based on Kabbalah. I would like to talk about that more, but I'm focusing just on the science right now of just the science right now. That's so let's look okay, I have one more PowerPoint. So let's look at Penrose's orchestrated objective reduction. Monism, the doctrine which refers to all phenomenon to a single ultimate constituent or agent. Material monism, mind is explained by and resolved into matter. Neural monism, matter, mind, and the phenomenon are manifestations or modifications of one substance, like the substance of Spinoza, which is capable of an objective and subjective aspect. So idealistic monism, mentalism, matter, and its phenomenon explained as a modification of mind quality to provide the fundamental component of reality. So you had Whitehead, process and reality. Whitehead and Leibniz support an idealistic monist mental framework such that a system ordinarily considered physical are constructed from mental entities. The experience has a vector character, a common measure of intensity, and specific forms of feelings that convey that intensity. If we substitute the term energy for the conception of quantitative emotional intensity and the term form of energy from the concept of specific form of feeling, and remember that in physics, vector means definite transmission from elsewhere, we see that this metaphysical description of the simplest elements is the constitution of actual entities, agrees absolutely with the general principles according to which the notions of modern physics framed. So occasions of experience, Whitehead thus describes the ultimate concrete entities of the universe as being actual occasions of experience, each bearing a quality akin to feeling, and hence broadly subscribes to a panpsychist concept of experience where even a temporal event in the career of an electron has a kind of proto-mentality. A particular spatial temporal experience, such as that it experiences relationships with the world around as vectored emotion experience, albeit Whitehead diverts from a simple panpsychism as the discrete occasions of experience have been related to quantum state reductions. It's the Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis. Postulate 1. Conscious thought is essentially non-computable. Echoing results of non-computability from Gödel, Turing, Penrose claims that mathematical understanding cannot be encapsulated by a set of rules and that provides a clue as to the processes that must instantiate it. Postulate 2, objective reduction defines a type of quantum self-reduction, collapse of superposed quantum states to one microscopic state that is emergent feature of some quantum systems. It is an objective feature of the quantum system. Such self-reduction is not a computable process. Quantum self-reductions, contra-reductions, subjective reductions defines a unique occasion of experience, a conscious instant. Although theoretically panpsychist, at 10 million years, the point of self-reduction in a single electron is longer than the time modern man has walked the earth. Postulate 3, the provisions of quantum objective reduction in the brain lies within the microtubule cytoskeleton of the neuron. So the scope of the Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis targets firmly held core theory in 3 distinct disciplines. Postulate 1, logic, computability and artificial intelligence. Postulate 2, quantum gravity, the union of general relativity and quantum mechanics. Postulate 3, the biology of the brain. And as such, it is perhaps unsurprising that the theory has attracted strong critical comment from all 3 disciplines. So postulate 1, the argument for non-computability. Penrose's argument derives from Gödel's theorem and is concerned with how mathematics arrives at unassailable demonstrations of mathematical proof. See also Lucas for a subtly different, more direct critique of computational theories of the human mind based on Gödel's theorem. Penrose purports to demonstrate that human mathematicians are not using a nobly sound argument to ascertain mathematical truths. Postulate 2, quantum objective reduction. Quantum system which remains isolated from its environment behaves as a wave of possibilities and exists as a complex number-valued superposition of many possible quantum states. The behavior of such wave-like objects can be described by a state vector which evolves deterministically according to the Schrödinger equation U. It is a transition known as wave function collapse, quantum state reduction. Such quantum superpositions lead to non-superposed stable macrostructures, one of the many possible eigenstates of the quantum operator. According to the most conventional standard interpretation of the quantum mechanics, the Copenhagen interpretation, the evolution of the eigenstate is entirely random, which led Einstein to a famous remark, "You believe in a God that plays dice." Possible forms of quantum reduction, perhaps coherent superposition persists until a random reduction R process occurs, or perhaps coherent superposition persists until an active observation occurs, subjective reduction, Schrödinger's cat, or perhaps coherent superposition persists indefinitely over time in the multiple universes, an ideal that physicist Hugh Everett, father of Mark Everett, singer and guitarist famously developed working with his thesis advisor, Wheeler. Almost astonishingly, this is currently considered one of the mainstream interpretations of quantum physics. So Penrose's new physics of objective reduction, OR. Alternatively, Penrose has argued that the reduction is defined by a deeper non-computational process that cannot be calculated algorithmically, since in most cases reduction is entangled with random efforts from the environment. Penrose suggests R is actually a close approximation to a non-computable objective reduction. Hence, usually OR is virtually distinguishable from R. However, when the quantum system remains coherent and isolated from the environment, then it becomes possible for the state to collapse spontaneously in accordance with the objective scheme OR that Penrose suggests behaves in fundamentally non-computable ways. Moreover, OR involves the geometry of the universe at its deepest level. So consciousness and objective reduction. An OR, a conscious event, occurs if an organized quantum system that is able to isolate and sustain superposition until its specific quantum gravity threshold for space-time separation is met. The quantum system then non-computable self-reduces. For consciousness to occur, such self-reduction as opposed to random reduction from the environment is essential. Such self-reduction in instantaneous and has been suggested as a candidate for Whitehead's occasion of experience, the fundamental component of reality. Subjective reductions in consciousness. Only large collections of particles acting coherently in a single macroscopic quantum state could sustain coherent superposition in a time frame long enough to reach OR threshold and brief enough to be relevant to consciousness. The OR process must be at least transiently isolated from the environment long enough for OR to take place. Quantum entanglement with the environment would result in random processes to take place. Cascades of discrete OR gives rise to perceptual unity and an unbroken stream of consciousness. So the superposition of space-time, 4D reality space-time is a 3D space plus 1D time. The 4D space-time is slightly curved according to Einstein's general theory of relativity in a way which encodes the gravitational fields of all mass densities. Consider superposed quantum states in which the relative mass distributions differ significantly from each other. Such states will have different space-time geometries, and the superposed state will involve a quantum superposition of these differing space-time geometries. There's currently no accepted way of dealing with this. However, many authors may have tentative suggestions. There's no existing evidence for Penrose objective reduction, but the theory is considered to be testable, and plans have been in hand to carry out a relevant experiment. So it's a speculation, objective reduction, such quantum superposition of space-time forces, a bifurcation of space-time, and is inherently unstable, with a lifetime given by the product of the temporal and spatial separation, after which it will reduce to a single state, being one or other of the original superimposed states. The future state is proposed to be selected by a non-computable influence embedded in the fundamental level of space-time geometry at the Planck scale. Penrose links the influence to a deep Platonic reality representing pure mathematical truth, aesthetic, and ethical values. OR and neural processing. An important feature of Penrose objective reduction is that the time to collapse a function of the mass energy of the object undergoing collapse. Thus, the greater the superposition, the faster it will undergo OR, and vice versa. Tiny superpositions, an electron separated from itself, if isolated, would require 10 million years to reach OR threshold. An isolated 1 kilogram object would reach OR threshold in 10 to the negative 37 seconds. Objects somewhere between the scale of an electron and the scale of a cat could collapse within a timescale that was relevant to neural processing. Postulate 3, where a non-computable process is in the brain. Properties of the brain require for quantum coherent superposition, OR, and relevant to consciousness might include high prevalence, functional importance, periodic crystalline structure, ability to transiently isolate from the environment, functionally coupled to quantum events, a cylindrical possible waveguide, sustainable for information processing. Stuart Hameroff has suggested the neuronal cytoskeleton microtubules appear to fulfill all the above criteria. Microtubules form The cytoskeleton of the neuron, microtubule subunits are hypothesized to be means of harnessing appropriate quantum effects. Microtubule-associated protein from weighted linkages between microtubules to form cytoskeletal lattice networks. These networks have information processes capable in their own right and also may influence macroscopic classical neuronal behavior, synapses, cell firing. So Orch OR, orchestrated objective reduction, it is hypothesized that microtubule-associated protein MAP attachment sites orchestrate or tune quantum oscillations in the microtubule lattice and regulate self-collapse, hence objective reduction. Such orchestrated self-collapse is a time-irreversible process creating an instantaneous now event. Sequences of such events form the stream of consciousness. Orchestrated objective reduction thus defines self-selecting processes in the fundamental space-time geometry of the universe, and if, as Whitehead and others suggest, experience as a fundamental component of space-time, then orchestrated OR may well begin to address the hard problem of consciousness. Against Penrose's theory, the temperature of the brain is too high for quantum events. Surface water microtubule is ordered and may isolate microtubules to enable suitable quantum coherence. High temperature superconductivity research is constantly raising the temperature upwards towards room. Gödel was talking about consistencies of mathematical systems, not mathematical understanding, but Penrose generalizes Gödel-Turing's argument. Quantum mechanics is not complete. Orchestrated reduction is at best speculation, at worst just plain wrong. In online critique of Penrose and Psyche, few criticized his physics. Biologists nearly unanimous in their disagreement of there being any quantum effects observable in neuron behavioral. Poor quality of alternative biological theories of consciousness, experiments still ongoing. So hence why I didn't cover this in my previous lectures. So the previous study sessions, I covered basically everything up to this and just mentioning this because this is largely, it's testable, it's not considered scientific in the way that theories are supposed to be. So those are my PowerPoints. I'm going to give an overview of some of the scientific evidence. Let me catch up, look at the chat real quick. I appreciate people watching. And, you know, I'm going to have a talk with Jennifer Saturday night about reincarnation based on these theories. I want to get these theories out there. And Mustafli is asking about Einstein and Kabbalah. Unlikely. So, I mean, Einstein delved into Kabbalah a tiny bit. It's unlikely he knew it that well. If you want to say, like, it was his Jewish mind, even though he didn't formally study these things, that may have helped him develop a theory that corresponds with Kabbalah that's possible. He did have, like, rabbis in his background and, you know, connections with the Jewish community, although there doesn't appear to be any evidence that he formally studied those topics. And I attached that literature about Einstein's religion, which isn't really Judaism. So, I mean, he was a Jew and his views on Judaism, but his outlook for understanding the world was certainly wouldn't be what most people would consider Jewish. Okay, so keep going. Let's look at this article. So I've finished with the PowerPoints. I've went over, you've seen an overview of kind of these theories, where they're coming from. So let's look at some actual scientific papers. Okay, whether or not, okay, so this, we're talking about the natural history of consciousness and the question of whether plants are consciousness in relation to the Hameroff-Penrose quantum physical Orch OR theory of universal consciousness, because these microtubules don't only exist in the human brain, they exist in lower single-celled organisms, in fact. So according to this theory, which might correspond with previous vitalism and the ancients, how they viewed the world, that this consciousness that our brain works to tap into. It's not something our brain creates, but something our brain harnesses as a natural phenomenon in the world. And the question, do plants do the same thing? Whether or not plants exhibit consciousness in the sense that they possess a sensation of self is uncertain. Unlike humans and certain animals, plants cannot be interrogated directly on this matter. In any case, it is possible that states of consciousness, like brains and nervous systems of animals, have evolved and developed in different ways depending on their phylogeny. However, some of the criteria by which consciousness is inferred to be present in animals are met by plants. For example, plants display features of cognition, sensing and response, and of learning and memory, which in animals contribute to the conscious state. Plants also possess a rudimentary nervous system similar to that found in basal animals and have perhaps a simple brain, as well as showing slow and fast transmissible electrical activity, all of which are strong correlates of consciousness in animals. However, the question of consciousness in general can be approached in a different way. This is by taking the orchestrated objective reduction hypothesis, the Orch OR of Hameroff and Penrose, as a starting point. The Orch OR hypothesis, which is based in quantum physics, proposes that when a sufficient mass of tubulin microtubules has assembled into cytoskeletal microtubules within neuronal cells of the brain, these structures become sites of quantum computation of quantum state reduction events resulting in moments of proto-consciousness. Because plant cells also have a large populations of microtubules, and because plant microtubules share properties with those animal neuronal microtubules, which putatively orchestrate OR events, plant microtubules might also be sites of quantum reduction events and hence lead to momentary proto-consciousness. The extent to which the Orch OR hypothesis is applicable to plants is examined, and is argued that within the plant body, the most likely tissues where OR events could be located and promote proto-consciousness is to be found in the system of ray cells of tree trunks, in which bundled microtubules and actin filaments are prevalent. A single complete ray complex is estimated to contain about as many microtubulin molecules as a single human cerebral neuron. Okay, try to read a little bit of this. Despite the efforts of neurobiologists, philosophers, and psychologists, the nature of consciousness remains elusive. The usual model taken for consideration of human consciousness, the major theories in which, from Descartes in the 17th century to the quantum mechanics of the 20th century, and the manner in which each of these theories fits with the prevailing scientific view of the world, have been discussed by Seeger. Not only is human consciousness the most advanced of its kind, but it is, of all presumed types of consciousness, also the one most available to empirical study. Recently, a novel and apparently universal theory of consciousness, which brings a provisional, though theoretical, answer to the question, was proposed in its latest form by Stuart Hameroff and Robert Penrose. The theory deals with the preconditions for a moment of consciousness. It places quantum physical process center stage and deploys the argument that cytoskeletal microtubules, particularly those contained within neuronal cells, are sites where crucial proto-consciousness events are initiated. The consequences of these events are then relayed to the brain, where they're perceived as moments of proto-conscious experience. Because microtubules are widespread and abundant in all forms of life except bacteria, it follows that the Hameroff-Penrose hypothesis could be considered in relation to organisms other than man, that is, whether intercellular tubulin and empties are found. Hence, it should be possible to discover whether the elements that uphold the theory and which make possible a proto-conscious event are present in the biological makeup of non-human organisms, and hence confer upon these organisms similar moments of proto-conscious experience. It should also be remarked that although this is not the only theory to have placed consciousness and its neurobiological correlates within the domain of quantum physics, the Hameroff-Penrose hypothesis is the one which is currently attracting a great deal of attention due to not only its testable proposals, but also to its theoretical underpinnings, which themselves are tending to lead towards a deepening consideration of gravity within the context of quantum mechanics in general. Although Hameroff and Penrose specify the conditions which, according to their quantum physical theory, initiate what the term proto-conscious event, these authors have left it to the others to describe what actually constitutes the broader aspect of consciousness. They do say, however, that consciousness implies a sense of self and defines our existence. Penrose and Penrose have also put forth evidence from observation of meditative states as being relevant to an understanding of the conscious states. The advantage is of this less conventional but nevertheless supportive viewpoint is that consciousness can hereby be considered not only from a top-down holistic perspective starting from the correlates of higher states of consciousness, but can also be linked with the more everyday but nevertheless fundamental observations of this state. This means the question of consciousness need not rely entirely on bottom-up reductionist perspective centered on sensory stimuli and response mechanisms, such as by Crick and Koch, but can also espouse more spiritual aspects of the question. Taking both viewpoints together, as proposed by Sperry, suggests that not only could a fairly complete tiered structure of consciousness be prepared, but mechanisms could also be uncovered by which this tiered structure comes about. Then would follow the possibility of examining the degree to which different non-human organisms, including plants, have developed the potentiality and perhaps the capacity for conscious and capacity to associate fundamentally with sensitive to the process of living within a particular environment, guided either by instinct or environment. However, as soon as the question of non-human and plant types of consciousness is muted, investigators become cautious. Okay, what is plant consciousness? Definitions of consciousness usually start with the supposition that is a property of a brain fed moment by moment with inputs from the sense organs via nervous system. In humans, these various momentary sensations are bound together by the brain to produce feelings of continuous awareness and at the same time generate a representation of the organism's experience in its internal and external world. The immediate product of such an integrative system can be regarded as core consciousness, which is subjective and private to the organism. The manner in which the various sensory inputs are handled by the brain leads to the conceptualization of a range of functional attributes to which terms such as cognition, memory, feelings, thought, so on are applied. In the case of plants, cognition and memory have been critically discussed in scientific literature and are reasonably well accepted as attributes of plants as the notions that plants possess both a simple brain and a simple nervous system. Cognition is a source of experience, and cognitive experiences may well be assimilated by plants not only to institute immediate responses, but also to be stored as a memory. Both circumstances form a base for primary plant consciousness. However, it is entirely another matter whether a plant is able to bind together the manifold varieties of its experience and thereby form, and here one needs the language of metaphor, representation of itself and of its world upon the screen of plant mind, phytomind that is deep questions of plant consciousness. Seth et al. Proposed 17 criteria which conform to the neuronal brain-based conscious state of humans, by which the degree of consciousness in non-human animals and other animals could be assessed using the patterns of behavior and reference. Humans therefore serve as the benchmark for discussions of consciousness in general. However, not only are many of the 17 criteria inapplicable to many animal species of their much simplified behavior patterns, but many are also inapplicable to plants. Nonetheless, two of the criteria, learning and decision-making, can be adapted in modified form and analogized to plant processes which indicate corresponding experience of in response to the outside world. There may also be traces of conditions that fulfill four other criteria: electroencephalogical signature, EEG, widespread brain activity, internal consistency. Okay, I encourage people to read through this. Let's see if they current state of evidence on this. So that they've looked at all the tests conducted on plants. So the evolution of animals and plants has allowed each to develop a sensorium and a brain. The emergent state, accompanied by consciousness, has appeared in some animals, including man. The ordinary state of man is characterized by EEG record exhibiting a frequency of 4 hertz. In plants, spontaneous APs with frequencies 1 or 2 orders of magnitude less than this have been recorded. Nevertheless, both animals and plants exhibit a type of proto-consciousness in which, even if there is no reasoning or thought, there is sensitive awareness and cognizance of their respective internal physiological environments and their external physical environments. Man, however, has developed further capabilities and is able to experience a higher state of consciousness. In this case, it may be that the bundling of microtubules and neurons has provided the criterion mass for a more intensive vibration of 40 hertz recorded from EEGs, according to the emergence of the state 4 self-reflective consciousness, and sometimes also a state 5 samadhi. Unfortunately, it is not known how this advancement of consciousness, the steps forward from states 2 and 3 to state 4, and then to state 5 have taken place, but it might be on the basis of Orch OR hypothesis related to the increasing mass and development of microtubules in specific cells. The formula developed in the Orch OR hypothesis predicts that as self-energy mass of microtubules increase, the frequency of quantum reduction events leading to protoconscious impulses increases. So state of conscious mindfulness or awareness emerges an unfolding of the implicate quantum order into the explicated material aspects of existence through the presence of microtubules. It is the ability to be consciously aware of the electrical impulses initiated by microtubules and whose passage of microtubules direct towards the brain that releases or realizes the potential for awareness. Thus, plants probably lag one step behind the experimental world of animals, for although both plants and animals may have attained state 2 and maybe state 3 of mind, animals and humans in particular have achieved the possibility of self-reflective consciousness. State 4, it is from the last mentioned autogenerative desire of self-reflection, the property of state 4, that psychological or psychokinetic evolution of man will continue and will be accompanied by parallel cultural evolution. On the other hand, Bergson was more comprehensive in considering not just human life, but life as a whole. Now, the more we fix our attention on the continuity of life, the more we see that organic evolution resembles the evolution of consciousness, in which the past pushing into the present causes a new form of awareness, incommensurable with what went before. Acknowledgement of the displacement of the degree of consciousness between plants and animals should enable humanity with its higher grade consciousness and rapid mobility, not only to mature, comprehend, and value the relative stillness of the lower grade plant proto-consciousness, but also of both animals and plant to share mutual experience through primary perception. This displacement of state of consciousness between plants and animals may be lawful in another way to maintain the balance of nature. To paraphrase Bergson, the component of an ecosystem on becoming momentary conscious would barely have outlived the wish to emancipate itself when it would be recaptured by necessity. Okay, I encourage people, if they have time, to read that whole article. Hope people are watching and enjoy. So let's look at an article by Stuart Hameroff. I'm not going to read this much, but so Hameroff is the anesthesiologist who together teamed up with Penrose, the physicist, to put the theory together, suggesting that the conduit for these quantum states was the microtubule. And we talked about free will and the problems of free will. And so now Hameroff is claiming that his theory allows there to be free will, as opposed to the previous attempts at explaining consciousness purely based on the physical brain mechanisms and neural networks, which were mostly deterministic, that quantum brain biology could save the room for free will. Conscious free will is problematic because brain mechanisms causing consciousness are unknown. Measurable brain activity correlating with conscious perception apparently occurs too late for real-time conscious response. Consciousness thus being considered epiphenomenal illusion and determinism. Our actions in the world around us seem algorithmic and inevitable. The Penrose-Hameroff theory of an orchestrated objective reduction identifies discrete conscious moments with quantum computations and microtubules inside the brain, like 40 per second, in concert with gamma synchrony, EEG. Microtubules organize neuronal interiors and regulate synapses. In OR microtubule quantum computations occur in integration phases in dendrite and cell bodies of integrate and fire brain neurons, connected and synchronizing by gap junctions, allowing entanglement of microtubules among many neurons. Quantum computations is entangled microtubules terminate by Penrose objective reduction, or proposal for quantum state reduction in conscious moments linked to fundamental space-time geometry. Each OR reduction selects microtubule states which can trigger axonal firings or control behavior. The quantum computations are orchestrated by synaptic inputs and memory. If correct, OR can account for a conscious causal agency. Resolving problem 1 regarding problem 2, OR can cause temporal non-locality, sending quantum information backwards in classical time, enabling conscious control of behavior. 3 lines of evidence for brain backward time effects are presented. Regarding problem 3, Penrose OR invokes non-computational influence from information embedded in space-time geometry, potentially avoiding algorithmic determinism. In summary, Orch OR can account for real-time conscious causal agency, avoiding the need for consciousness to be seen as an epiphenomenal illusion. Orch OR can rescue consciousness and free will. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to read through this one, but I encourage other people to. Give another article by Hameroff, The Quantum Mind. This is from 2011. When did consciousness arise? Basically, there are 3 possibilities for the origin of consciousness in the universe. Number 1, which is the most popular, I will say among scientists, certainly consciousness emerged as a property of biological complexity at some point during the course of evolution, and we can argue about when. Number 2 is a more religious view that consciousness has been in the universe all along. For example, it's the ground of being or God is suggested by spiritual approaches and or the fine structure of space-time geometry. Now I will argue that the last clause in the fine structure of space-time geometry is more or less equivalent to the ground of being or God to some extent as suggested by spiritual approaches. The third is a little bit different for number 2 in that sense that the precursor of consciousness has been in the universe all along, with consciousness emerging during evolution as quantum molecular processes in the brain connecting to the fine structure of space-time geometry. So number 3 is kind of a combination of 1 and 2. Okay, so we saw on the slide some of this stuff where I showed you Hameroff was mentioning the emergence where consciousness may have emerged, and so I encourage people who are interested to read through that. And I got 2 more scientific articles, hopefully read a little bit from, and maybe I'll call it a night. Okay, so entanglement in the quantum brain. After a brief introduction regarding the basic principles of quantum theory, I will concentrate the attention on the issue of non-locality by describing and discussing the theory and the experimental proofs which underline the physical mechanisms of quantum entanglement. In the first case, I will describe the ERP thought experiment by David Bohm's theory by discussing the meaning of quantum potential as a non-local guide to the reality of the whole, just starting from elementary particles. Discussion on non-locality will then culminate in the concept of implicate order as a global consciousness of the universe. The role of the human brain will then be presented as a neural correlate of individual consciousness. At this point, the speech will focus on Penrose-Hameroff quantum theory of the brain. In this context, I will explain how consciousness emerges from the brain as an orchestrated collapse of the quantum wave function that describes microtubules in the brain by assuming that they are a quantum coherent entity all over the brain. The simple E equals h divided by t, total energy associated to microtubules. Penrose equation will be amply discussed by showing how the number of microtubules in a living being affects the level of consciousness up to the asymptotic superior limit for an infinite value for E corresponding to God's mind, namely the implicate order for excellence. Finally, work hypothesis elaborated by this author will be presented to the role of the human soul as a non-local software that is strictly linked to the body as hardware and whose role is to acquire information which can then be uploaded to the non-local library located in the quantum void. This presentation will be wholly non-technical, but rather layman style. Several theories regarding a possible, I'm just going to read the part about the soul here. Several theories regarding a possible link between junk DNA and the soul are being developed according to recent studies by some biophysicists. What is of interest to me is to try to hypothesize what is the role of the soul, which can which I substantially interpret as the subtle vector of consciousness when the body that brings it dies, when no physical brain exists anymore. I've imagined so far only qualitatively the following scenario. The soul is a physical and non-transcendent entity that, in form of quantum field, can be manifest in form of consciousness in any body that has characteristics of quantum coherence, not only the brain. Its role as the terminal of a big supercomputer is twofold: to work as software or of a hardware called body to collect pure information coming from both intelligence and emotions. That information is automatically and non-locally uploaded on a hard disk located in the quantum void to the Planck scale at 10 to the negative 34th centimeter. How does it work? All the thoughts and emotions are constantly non-locally uploaded there, like to an internet website, by every single soul. Where does such a process occur? Simply within the quantum void that is present inside the atoms of our body. All the atoms of matter are mostly made of pure void, where protons, neurons, and electrons are immersed. If we hypothesize that this void is the site of universal consciousness, the main source from where the quantum potential is born, then everything coming from us goes there to be memorialized just through an upload operation, being instantly transmitted to a big library. That library is not located at a specific place, but is everywhere in the universe, just inside the quantum void itself, and all the atoms of the universe are immersed into it as well. The hypothesis here is that the void contains the memory of all that which was thought or felt during one or more lives. Just working as a quantum supercomputer that collects every information collected by the living beings, all this can potentially be downloaded. Therefore, this multidimensional universe might be an incommensurable work of engineering informatics, a creation by other intelligence, a highly evolved one. With such a purely hypothetical scenario, creation of universes made of matter would be carried out by inflating virtual particles located inside the quantum void. This would bring to many big bangs all that which is real in each universe would remain non-locally connected to the original source through the quantum potential. Such engineering involving both real matter and consciousness might come from what I like to call hypothetically the builders, but calling them gods would certainly diminish the asymptotic and unknowable figure God. Conclusion: the birth of quantum theory 7 decades ago and its growth in recent years has demonstrated to all of us that the reality of a very deep level is not knowable using standard determinisms of Newton physics, but rather a probability operator named wave function. At this level of elementary particles, the universe is known only when we observe it, but at the same time, due to collapse in the wave function, we observe only one out of many possible of existence. Only one reality is made known to us. All the others disappear from our eyes unless, like the other many world interpretations by physicists such as Everett, Weidmann, Deutsch, and all the other possibilities, collapse simultaneously in other directions. In addition to the more classical assumptions of quantum mechanics, a very spooky phenomenon occurs among particles that have interacted at least once. This is quantum entanglement. In its non-local characteristic, are totally incompatible for the propagation of electromagnetic signals. Quantum entanglement is not due to energy of any kind, but rather to a transmission of pure information whose source is represented by Bohm's quantum potential, which might be compared with cosmic quantum supercomputer of non-local kind. This information field may link all particles together if they interacted together at least once. Something of this link has been found through several experiments, as well as theoretically demonstrated through both thought experiments and mathematical models. This field is kind of a director of all matter particles in the universe, which can be unveiled during some experiments. Such a process seems to be operational in the brain too, and this is quite natural and logical if, as it is probable, the quantum potential is the non-locally manifested consciousness of matter, able to link everything simultaneously. Then the consciousness that emerges from a situation of quantum coherence in the brain through microtubules is a manifestation of a general cosmic law in a biological and sentient beings. In this light, the brain is sort of a radio receiver that enables the universe to be conscious of itself through its many sentimental terminals. Otherwise, without intelligent life in the universe, the mechanism of consciousness would be just mechanical but not intelligible by both intelligence and emotions. Due to this, life seems to be absolutely necessary process in the economy of the universe. At the non-local level, the brain might be also intended as a connection point between the micro world with its spooky effects and the macro world with its causal physical laws. That's probably the sense of the Vitruvian Man of Leonardo da Vinci. Okay, we got one last article I'd like to go over. most recent one. Consciousness in the universe is scale invariant, implies an event horizon of the human brain. From Neuroquantology, Dirk Meiser and Hans Geisig. This one had some nice graphics. Consciousness in the universe is scale invariant and implies an event horizon of the human brain. Our brain is not a standalone information processing organ. It acts as a central part of our integral nervous system with recurrent information exchange with the entire organism and the cosmos. In this study, the brain is conceived to be embedded in a holographic structured field that interacts with resonant sensitive structures in the various cell types of our body in order to explain earlier reported ultra-rapid brain responses and effective operation of the metastable nervous system. A field receptive mental workspace is proposed to be communicating with the brain. Our integral nervous system is seen as the dedicated neurotransmission and multi-cavity network that, in a non-dual manner, interacts with the proposed supervening metacognitive domain. Among others, it is integrating discrete patterns of eigenfrequencies of photonic sonic waves, thereby continuously updating a time-symmetric global memory space of the individual. Its toroidal organization allows for coupling of gravitational dark energy, zero-point energy field, as well as Earth magnetic fields, energies, and transit wave information into brain tissue, and thereby is instrumental in high-speed consciousness and subconscious information processing. We propose that the supposed field receptive workspace and the mutual interaction with the whole nervous system generates self-consciousness is conceived as operating from a fourth spatial dimension hyposphere. Its functional structure is adequately defined by the geometry of the torus that is envisioned as a basic unit of spacetime. The latter is instrumental in collecting the pattern of discrete solution frequencies that provide an algorithm of coherent life processes. As earlier identified by us, it is postulated that consciousness in the entire universe arises through scale invariant nested toroidal coupling of various energy fields that may include quantum error correction. In the brain of the human species, this takes the form of the proposed holographic workspace that collects active information in a brain event horizon representing an internal and fully integrated model of the self. This brain supervening workspace is equipped to convert integrated coherent wave energies into attractor-type standing waves that guide the related chordal template to a higher coordinating of reflection and action, as well as network synchronity as required for conscious states in relation to its scale invariant global character. We find support for universal information matrix that was extensively described earlier as supposed implicate order, as well as a spectrum of space-time theories in current physics. The presence of a field receptive resonance workspace associated with but not reducible to our brain may provide an interpretation framework for widely reported but poorly understood transpersonal conscious states and algorithmic origin of life. It also points out the deep connection of mankind with the cosmos and our major responsibility for the future of the planet. That's some cool diagrams. Trying to imagine like our sense perception of these fourth dimensional processes. I encourage people more interested to read through this. I skim this. Hopefully, this stream will spark more interest in the subject, and you will put more research into this and talk about it more. And minimally, this will be preparation for a discussion on reincarnation Saturday night, which is based on these theories. So people looking forward to that discussion Saturday night with Jennifer about reincarnation. These are some of the theories that they're based off of. So I encourage people to read as much of this as they can. And hopefully those PowerPoints were pretty useful, some good visualizations. And this, I didn't include this in my overview the first time to detail because this is more theoretical than lab tested. But what science could answer towards solving the hard problem of consciousness these days is extremely limited. So, this is probably the best worked out physical theory, the Orch OR theory, including quantum mechanics in the fourth dimension, and the understanding of what is matter. So biology working on the assumptions of physics but they can't really explain what matter is. So you're returning the realm of physics to the physicists. Okay, so it looks like I'm going to end right now. I got 8 viewers. Anyone's got any questions in the chat, now would be the time to ask, or I'm going to end the stream and call it a night. I hope people gain from this. I'm glad I had some viewership. Hopefully, Saturday night will be interesting. And this is a topic I'm always studying. I have a lot of books on. I'm reading. Just for the stream, I skimmed at least 500 pages, and went through a lot of PowerPoints. And you could see how complicated this stuff is. I'm by no means. I'm not a PhD. I'm not an expert in this subject. Just someone who cares deeply about it. Is an investigator of consciousness and what's behind consciousness for my whole adult life. And I'm doing these public study sessions to attract interest in the subject and hopefully push it forward. And I think I've covered largely the complete overview of the modern state of scientific understanding of consciousness. So I haven't covered more like the Vedic and Kabbalistic and different spiritual systems and reincarnation. I'd like to get into that, but I wanted to cover, as my perception, the brain, that consciousness thought arises from the non-physical. It's not a physical process, and that the brain is just controlling sense perception and motor control of the body, and that scientists incorrectly assume that not only consciousness but thought will be attached to the brain. So it's possible, like this Orch OR theory is showing that consciousness is in fact attached to the brain, but the brain is a vehicle to receive non-material signals in the quantum world. So it's like a combination of the two. Like Hameroff said, that you're combining the old, materialistic and spiritualistic. Although I'm not sure about that. Like from my perception of consciousness, might be more Cartesian in essence, that I'm more of a dualist. And so, these discussions and sessions will continue. And hope everyone who watched this enjoyed and got some information out of it. And minimally, I think I found some of the better PowerPoints available on the subject, and some of the top reading material, Penrose-Hameroff, most recent scientific testing, some related literature to how this might further solve into mystical concepts. So I guess with that, I'm going to call it a night. Shalom. Have a great night. Hope to continue with these discussions. Feel free to comment, and looking forward to stream with Jennifer about the implications of what I talked to today into reincarnation. So have a good night, everyone. Take care.